Well, hello there, and welcome to Roundtable on Telile Community Television. I'm your host, Adam Cook. On this week's show, I have a panel discussion for you about whether wind energy development could cause negative impacts on the fishery locally and regionally. I'll also take you to a protest march that was held on Wednesday of this week in Port Hawkesbury regarding the Phoenix federal payroll system and how inefficiencies in the system have led many federal civil servants hanging high and dry. And you're going to hear commentary from the Warden of Richmond County and the Mayor of Port Hawkesbury about events that have been happening and issues that have been coming up at the council meetings for these areas over the past couple of weeks. But we begin with an update on the Port Royal Bridge. It's been sitting idle since 2017, and just recently, machinery and equipment from the Nova Scotia Public Works Department arrived to start taking apart the bridge, which will not be replaced after it's removed. The issue hit the Municipal Council chambers in Arichat for the regular council meeting that took place on February 25th. We're going to take you there in just a moment, but first of all, here's a little background about what's been going on with the Port Royal Bridge just in the last few days and the last 7 years.
The Port Royal Bridge connects several communities just outside of West Arichat. They include Port Royal, St. Mary's, and a little farther down the road, Janvrin's Island. Residents of those communities have been forced to take a detour along nearby McCackern Road. The detour has been described as unsafe by some local residents, and it also takes them 1.3 kilometers out of their way before finally returning them to Highway 206. 1 week before the 2021 provincial election campaign wrapped up, the Liberal leader and Premier at the time, Ian Rankin, showed up in Port Royal to announce a commitment of $2 million to replace the bridge and provide other improvements on nearby roads. However, this spending was contingent on the Liberals being re-elected as government. That didn't happen, and now the Nova Scotia Department of Public Works has taken a different approach. On Friday, March the 1st, one day after work began at the Port Royal Bridge site, Nova Scotia Public Works Communications Advisor Gary Andrea provided the following update to Telile Community Television. Nova Construction was awarded the tender for the project with a low bid of $888,000. Due to the timelines associated with the road's closing for spring weight restrictions during the first full week of March, the contractor is moving gear to the site and hauling in materials needed for the removal in advance of the restrictions taking effect. The timeline in the tender was to have the structure removed by April 15th. A contractor can exceed that timeline for removal, according to Gary Andrea of Nova Scotia Public Works. In addition, Andrea's statement notes that McCackern Road will be repaved with some of the turns widened along with the required drainage updates. Guardrail installation and widening of the road along with erosion protection will be completed in various areas with a scheduled completion date of the fall of 2024. The preceding statement was provided to Telile Community Television by Gary Andrea, Communications Advisor with the Nova Scotia Department of Public Works. This isn't sitting well with a number of community residents who have set up a Facebook group to help mobilize opposition to the bridge's removal. That group, led by Lakin Delory, seen here, garnered over 200 members in just over a week. The issue arose at the end of the February 25th regular council meeting in Arichat, courtesy of a former councillor with the Halifax Regional Municipality who is now making his home in Discoos. Matt Whitman asked council to take some action on the Port Royal Bridge during the final public question period of the night.
I've heard from many residents that are concerned and are looking for a solution after many years of patiently awaiting a fix. They aren't confident about a status quo McCackern Road solution. What's being done by the municipality to save this important piece of infrastructure?
This is a provincial piece of infrastructure, so the equipment wouldn't be deployed by us. I don't believe we have anything in the region, Matt. And also, should begin by saying thank you for your question and for coming in. I definitely have heard some concerns from the community as well. But at the end of the day, I mean, the best that council would be able to do, I guess, would be to write a letter of support and, I guess, to the province. But I I think before we would do that, we may want to hear from, some of the residents.
I know that this has been an issue since about 2017, and I'm sure there's been lots of time for letters to be written to the province and to the department and to the MLA. So I'm just wondering if there has been anything done recently or over the past 7 years to help retain and repair this important piece of infrastructure in partnership with the province.
But I don't think this has come to council before. Councillors, did we hear about this early on, maybe?
Yeah, I think it was something that Councillor Digdon perhaps brought up previously. Okay. And I'm kind of racking my brain in terms of whether or not we did write a letter or not. Like, it might have been early on in our time on council. Again, I don't remember. I do recall it being discussed, but I don't recall what.
I'm sure Councillor Digdon, I know, has brought it up in the past because it was a big concern even during the municipal election. Not that it's under our purview specifically, but and then shortly after the provincial election, there was an announcement they were going to replace it, but that didn't pan out, I guess, as the government changed. Yeah.
I think what had happened was people were mistaking a campaign promise for an announcement in that case. That's some dangerous territory because I believe the election was underway at that time. So I guess the short answer is I don't think we've had a formal ask, but if there is a group who would like to make an ask of council, then certainly we could entertain that. But just knowing that it is provincial infrastructure, so we don't have direct control over it.
Thank you, and I'm aware that it's provincial infrastructure, but these are Richmond County residents that are concerned, and I'm not sure that there's going to be a whole lot of assurance in a letter being written.
If you're here on behalf of this group, specifically to make the formal request that we do that, then we can do that. I just would always want to manage expectations, and I know you were a longtime councillor in LHRM, so you understand.
Yeah, so I think I could speak at least on behalf of the group to say that they would really appreciate a formal request that a letter be written to the province to get them to at least slow down and listen to the residents' concerns. Although it's been 7 years, it's been a long time, and it's an important piece of infrastructure. The fix to go around McEachern Road isn't a safe fix for many reasons, including the sea level at that area and the no guardrails, the terrible potholes, the speed, the tough difficulty getting out onto the highway from there. So I'd really appreciate if you could at least put together a quick letter.
We could send a quick note following this meeting to the MLA and make sure that we copy in Minister Masland as the minister for that particular department, requesting that maybe they provide us with some additional information and what the route through McEachern Road, how that's going to be treated, in their plan, and considering asking them to consider a slowdown. That's no problem.
In discussing the Port Royal Bridge issue at the February 25th council meeting, both Matt Whitman and members of council pointed out that equipment had already arrived at the Port Royal Bridge site hours before the council meeting.
I was there on the weekend and again yesterday, and there was no machinery when I was there, so that's a surprise to me that there was machinery there today.
According to Warden Amanda Mumberket, the municipality has no real control over the bridge or the adjacent roads because they are provincially run. However, she and her fellow councillors agreed to contact Richmond MLA Trevor Boudreau to reflect the concerns of area residents and see what can be done.
We want to take the opportunity to clarify, our roads in Richmond County are, almost primarily, they're primarily administered by and owned by the provincial government. So we don't have a large network of municipal roads or bridges or culverts or anything of that type. What that means is that we don't have authority to make changes to those pieces of infrastructure. The bridge in Port Royal is a piece of provincial infrastructure, and just recently joined an online Facebook group so that I could kind of pay attention to some of the discussion happening, but we haven't really received any kind of formal requests from the group as a whole. So I'll definitely be connecting with them as well before, sending anything off to our MLA and the minister, because we want to make sure we are, getting kind of that feedback from the folks who live there and on all sides of the issue. And I have heard from from folks on all sides of the issue. So, so that's just something we need to keep in mind as well. But I think there's no harm in writing a letter, asking for a status update, asking to maybe slow things down a little bit so that the community can have a fuller conversation.
And as Nova Scotia Public Works crews continue their work at the Port Royal Bridge site with an eye towards the complete removal of the bridge later in the spring, Warden Mumberket says she's surprised by the quick acceleration of the timeline for this particular project in Western Isle-Madame.
Well, certainly the timing, it's difficult to be doing any kind of major construction this time of the year. It's kind of my feeling in general, but I'm no construction expert or engineering expert. So I would, obviously need to defer to the folks who are making those types of plans. They clearly have a plan in place. Surprised at the direction that they're taking and having it removed in the first place? Honestly, no. Bridges are really expensive pieces of infrastructure to maintain. I do know that there's an impact to the quality of life of the folks in the community there. But I also know that sometimes hard decisions need to be made. And I know we've struggled with some of those hard decisions at our municipal table as well. So I'm not surprised, but at the same time, definitely would be interested in having the conversation to just maybe slow things down a little bit.
And now we take you from Isle-Madame to Port Hawkesbury. On the last Wednesday afternoon in February, a protest took place in front of the Service Canada location on Reeve Street. The protesters were members of public sector unions who feel that a federal payroll program has been leaving them high and dry for the past 8 years. It's called the Phoenix Payroll System, and it has left hundreds of thousands of people without their payment for several months, and some of them are still trying to get back what they feel they've lost because of the Phoenix system and its inefficiencies. You're going to hear from a representative of Public Service Alliance of Canada in just a couple of moments. First of all, let's take you to the protest on Reeve Street in Port Hawkesbury.
Contrary to the song bearing his name, Frosty the Snowman was not a jolly, happy soul on the sidewalks of Port Hawkesbury on the final Wednesday of February. Frosty and his fellow costumed members of public sector unions around the Strait area were marking the 8th anniversary of the Phoenix pay system for civil servants across the country. These public sector workers don't consider it a happy anniversary. Since the federal government rolled out the Phoenix system early in 2016, there hasn't been a single pay period for federal government workers without some sort of issues. According to the Public Service Alliance of Canada, or PSAC, there are currently 440,000 pay problems within the Phoenix backlog. And since the Phoenix payroll system launched 8 years ago, over 300,000 public servants across Canada have been impacted, with some of them not being paid properly and some of them going unpaid for several months. Wednesday's protest in front of the Service Canada office on Reeve Street in Port Hawkesbury was one of several happening across Atlantic Canada and across the country. The Regional Vice President Atlantic for PSAC, Chris Deliberatore, visited the Port Hawkesbury site shortly after attending a similar protest in Sydney.
Our members have been either underpaid, overpaid, or not paid at all. So today we're continuing to bring this to light, to put pressure on government. But additionally to that, we're also now calling on the government to come to the table and negotiate additional damages for the impact that the Phoenix pay system has had on our members, for the stress and anxiety it's caused members and others who have gone so far as to having lost their homes as a result of Phoenix and not being paid appropriately, correctly, or on time, or at all.
For Deliberatore and his PSAC colleagues, these continuing issues with the Phoenix payroll system are particularly irritating, given that PSAC sat down with the federal government in 2020 to try to work out a damages agreement involving the first 4 years of problems with Phoenix.
After 4 years, we had negotiated a damages agreement. Now we're another 4 years in and still facing those same issues with no end in sight. So it's time again for the government to come to the table to negotiate additional ongoing damages for our members, as well as for the severe losses that some of our members have suffered. Certainly disappointed and quite honestly very frustrated that we're now 8 years in and there's no end in sight to this.
PSAC officials also feel that Ottawa has let them down in terms of promises to repair the issues with the Phoenix payroll system during the last negotiation regarding damages from the first 4 years of the system.
There had been some movement on a next generation pay system, and that work is still ongoing, but it's not going fast enough. I mean, we're 8 years in and no end in sight. And I'm sure today that number that I just gave you, 444,000, that likely grew today. It's going to make it that much harder to go paycheck to paycheck when you're not getting the right paycheck.
With this in mind, Deliberatory is pleased to see horns honking and public support for the Port Hawkesbury protest, and a similar reaction for a protest that took place outside the Sydney Service Canada office at the same time.
It was very supportive. I mean, the public understand that they know that 8 years is too long, and that our members deserve better from their government and their employer to make sure that they get paid the way they're supposed to.
With this in mind, PSAC officials are warning that public sector unions are not finished with their battle with the federal government to ensure that those who were impacted by the Phoenix payroll inefficiencies get their fair share.
We've only just made that announcement today that we, as well as Public Institute of Professional Services of Canada, PIPS, and CAPE, two other federal public sector unions, are seeking these damages for more than 260,000 federal public workers. It's not just PSAC that's impacted by this; it's other government workers as well. So we've only just made that announcement that we are seeking these damages. It's not something that goes on at the traditional bargaining table, as in collective bargaining. This is more of a legal process for negotiating damages for pain and suffering and aggravation. But that's one small step. The other things that we need to have happen, we need the government to put the resources into the pay center to address that backlog and to fix these ongoing issues, to extend the retention bonuses that they had for these pay advisors that they've hired, as well as hire additional pay advisors to, again, help bring down that backlog of 444,000 cases. That's a big thing. We need an inquiry into the Phoenix pay system so that we can look at what caused this and make sure it never happens again, and just continue on until every one of our members is paid correctly every payday. We're going to be out here and we're going to be reminding the government and keeping pressure on government to fix this and make sure, as an employer, they're meeting their obligations to compensate their workers.
And even as the public sector launches the newest stage of its awareness campaign regarding the Phoenix payroll system, Deliberatory and his PSAC colleagues are hoping that the public's memory of what's happened over the last 8 years won't fade away like the snowflakes, even as their memories of this particular Port Hawkesbury protest wrap up.
If you see or know any of your friends and family that are public service workers, thank them for what they do, and help them by reaching out to your member of parliament to say, hey, this isn't right. Get out there and get the work done to make sure that these workers are receiving the pay that they're entitled to correctly every single payday, as they should.
You've heard a lot about offshore wind energy development in the past few months, and specifically about how offshore wind energy could help the green hydrogen sector in our area. However, there are some people locally and provincially that don't feel that a rush into wind energy is going to be helpful. Specifically, these are members of the fisheries sector for Nova Scotia, and they have concerns about how quickly wind energy developments are setting up shop. So I've convened a special panel discussion to talk about these issues. We're going to have an official with the Nova Scotia Fisheries Alliance join us, as well as the Executive Director of the Richmond County Inshore Fishermen's Association. Here's our conversation right now. So I'd like to start with you, Christine Babin, if I could, because this is an issue that has brought some mixed reaction over the past few months. We saw a public hearing held by the Cape Breton Partnership in Discoos before December. Several people issuing concerns from the fisheries sector about the potential impact of wind energy and green hydrogen developments. From your position from the Richmond County Inshore Fishermen's Association, what are you thinking about the rush to wind energy development and what it could mean for the fishery, not just in the Strait, but all the way across the province?
There is, concerns that are warranted. For sure, we've learned in the past with oil and gas that the fishing industry wasn't always consulted on some of the topics. And our fisheries, particularly in Atlantic Canada, has a big economic value. So, we certainly don't want to lose some of our fishing grounds and compromise one industry over another. We definitely are not against wind energy. We all work here, we live here, we know what climate change is. We're feeling the effects ourselves in the fishing industry. We just want to make sure that the wind energy is new. We don't have it yet in Canada. We feel there is not enough research out there to show any potential impacts on the fish stocks. And we certainly don't want to lose some of our valuable fishing grounds. So it's, it is concerning. And some of the fish harvesters that have attended these sessions, of course, have concerns. They haven't heard all sides of the story yet because the story is kind of just being written as we're going along. So we're just hoping to, continue being involved and that the government does take their time and ensures that the proper framework is in place, that the regulations and the policies and procedures are in place, the proper, any kind of compensation packages if things would go wrong. So yeah, just, there are concerns for sure.
Not that long ago, the warden of Richmond County, Amanda Mumperket, suggested that the oil and gas industry found a way to work collaboratively with the fishing industry to be able to coexist in the same waters. And with that in mind, that wind energy developments could coexist with fisheries to exist in the same waters. So your response seemed to suggest that it's not been that easy a relationship and that could be just as difficult with wind energy. Your thoughts on the warden's comment?
Well, my thoughts would be that the warden's basically comparing apples to oranges. In that case, we can coexist, but we want to ensure that the proper regulations are in place. When you're speaking of oil and gas, that's existed since 30 or 40, maybe 50 years, I'm not sure. But the installation of oil and gas caused significant potential harm to the environment. So, comparing one or two platforms offshore is a big difference with 10, 50, maybe 150 wind turbines that could be placed inshore or midshore, and more or less in our fishing ground. So, and again, going back to research and studies, we just feel there aren't enough studies and evidence out there to show that there are no, impacts to the ocean or even the environment, let alone marine environment. So it's kind of a little bit of a different situation, I guess. The factors are a little bit different.
Chris Viscato, I'd like to get your thoughts on the same concept, the idea that the fisheries have shared waters with petrochemical development over the past 40 to 50 years. Now, some officials are suggesting that wind energy could be very much the same idea. Is this, as Christine Babin has just suggested, comparing apples to oranges? Your thoughts on the shift from petrochemical development sharing waters with the Atlantic fishery to the potential for wind energy to do the same?
I think Christine's actually put it really very succinctly, because you have to think about it this way. When you're looking at an oil and gas development, what you've got is a point generally associated with the wellhead, generally associated with the producing platform, gathering infrastructure that happens. And then what you do is you bundle it all together and you take it off towards shore. What that means is that your damages that we're talking about are going to be related to incidents. So we're going to be related to a potential spill. Let's say that something happens to a wellhead, you end up with an uncontrolled release. We have the Fisheries Act, which is designed to deal with that, through whether it be a compensatory mechanism, mitigation, cleanup, all that fun stuff. Offshore wind development is fundamentally different. What you're doing is you're harnessing wind energy before it reaches the ocean. And you're doing that through a very, very broad landscape. We're talking of, somewhere on the order of hundreds of square kilometers or thousands of square kilometers with structures that are being erected in areas where there are no vertical structures. So it disrupts the natural ecosystem in very substantive ways. And the other piece is that transmission of energy from the wind to the water allows nutrients to be cycled, allows oxygen to be delivered to the bottom. It contains a very, very important ecosystem process. By removing that, we're fundamentally changing some of the basic parts of the ecosystem. We're not quite certain what it does. It is fair to say that the fishing industry has coexisted with oil and gas, but that has been largely because where it was sited and the exclusionary nature of it, although there were strong impacts, as Christine has talked about, related to the transmission infrastructure that was required to bring it to shore. Well, when we talk about something to do with offshore wind development, yes, there is a possibility for these two operations, whether it be fishing and other marine uses, to be able to coexist. But to do that's going to require really, really good planning to make sure that we're not actually, whether it be disrupting fishing activity and other aspects of not disrupting very, very important and sensitive life stages of marine species, such that fishery, that $2.6 billion of fishing revenue that comes into the province every single year, can be maintained with a strong offshore wind industry sitting there as well. So yes, they can coexist. We are hoping that they can coexist, but it's not going to be in the same way that we see offshore oil and gas development coexisting with the fishing industry. They're very, very different mechanisms. And I think it's very important for your viewers to understand that there are fundamental differences, and we can't just, rewrite something and replace offshore oil and gas with offshore wind, because that's just not quite going to cut it here.
Chris, I want to stay with you for just a moment because from our region, we're coming this from a perspective where there has been rapid development in terms of wind energy and green hydrogen. We've seen two companies setting up shop here, Everwind Fuels, based in Point Tupper, recently being given federal government debt forgiveness to be able to proceed with their green hydrogen development. And we're also seeing Bearhead Energy, that at one time was centering on liquefied natural gas. They're moving towards green hydrogen as well. Even an existing industry, Port Hawkesbury Paper, the Point Tupper paper mill, has set up a small green hydrogen development as part of its current activities. But what's your viewpoint from around the province in terms of this run towards wind energy and this development of wind energy as the de facto replacement for fossil fuels and for the burning of coal? What's your sense, just from where you're sitting right now, about how this impacts the province?
We're talking about almost a Klondike-style gold rush here. Essentially, a resource has been identified, and there's just this rapid push to get as many people out there to be able to access it as possible. And often what happens when we undergo those types of processes is it precludes reasonable, planned, responsible development. In the case of green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, depending on what the term of the day is, if you do a worldwide scan of this type of technology, it's very difficult to find facilities that are operating in the scale and the type of operations that are being proposed in many of these areas. So we're really on the front end of a technological wedge, which should actually require us to cast not doubt, but a little bit of caution as we approach those, to make sure that we're using our money wisely, we're using our land and our resources wisely. In many respects, the same applies when we're talking about offshore wind development. Yeah, a great example is, you spoke of several proponents that are out there talking about whether it be floating or fixed-based offshore wind platforms. Well, if you look at it worldwide, there's about 64,000 megawatts of offshore wind that's actually been deployed throughout the world. A lot of that is in Asia, a fair amount of that is in Europe, a little bit is starting to develop on the east coast of the US, none of it is in Canada. But the really important fact about that 64,000 megawatts is you only have about, I think it's around 190 megawatts of it is actually in floating platforms. And these are entirely test platforms that are being put out to test the technology. So that technology is not yet mature enough to be freely commercially available. Right now, the industry itself is talking about 2027 as the earliest date that the technology could be commercialized. So when a proponent is coming in advocating that this is the type of technology that we're going to use, we must take a little bit of a cautious note to say, okay, you're telling us you're going to use a technology that not necessarily has been commercialized or developed yet. And so you have to approach it with some degree of skepticism. And this is why we have this other process undergoing, which is that regional assessment process, because that's looking at that landscape to say, okay, so what areas of the ocean are suitable for these these multiple different types of development and industrial operations? And what can we do to make sure that they maintain, the integrity of the ocean ecosystem around it? What should we be watching out for? So we have a lot of proponents that are talking about things, and we yet don't have that regulatory structure in place to actually tell us how and where it's going to be done. So in many respects, we're kind of in a cart before the horse type of situation here. And the same applies if you look elsewhere around the province. We talk about, there's opportunities. There's the wind resource off Nova Scotia. Anybody who's been to the coast realizes it's massive, right? Yet there is a lot of other pieces that we have to consider, whether it be a grid tied. Are we going to feed it back into the grid? Are we actually going to use it to further decarbonize and hit that net zero approach? Or is it going to be turned into a hydrogen production? Right now, the grid itself is not really equipped to actually handle that much power to move it back to the rest of Canada. We also have to keep those types of aspects in mind. So I really sit back and consider this a bit of a Klondike gold mentality that we have here. And I think we should learn from our past mistakes as it comes to these things, which is, and Christine put it really well, let's take our time. Let's make sure that we're doing the right thing for the right reasons, and that will allow those sustainable economies that already exist to continue existing into the future.
I want to ask each of you about what you felt in terms of the level of consultation that both the proponents of these wind energy and green hydrogen developments and people like the Provincial Department of Natural Resources and Renewables and the Provincial Department of Fisheries have done with you and with others like you in terms of being able to set these developments up. Christine Babin, speaking on behalf of the Richmond County Inshore Fishermen's Association, do you feel that consultation's been there?
I'll tell you, yes, because greatly because of the alliance that we have formed, and Chris will kind of speak more about this, but because of the alliance, and the alliance is, of course, people like myself who represent other fishing associations across the province. So we have formed this alliance, and we have met with the province. We have met with some proponents. We have met with each other and the regional assessment committee. Myself, on a personal note, for our association, we have met with two proponents several times, and so the consultation has been there. And like Chris said, it's good in a way, but it's the horse before the cart type thing. But I guess it is good that the consultation is happening. So it's better than it's been in the past, for sure.
Okay, well, let's pick up on that same point with you, Chris Viscato, speaking on behalf of the Nova Scotia Fisheries Alliance. What's your take on the level of consultation that you've gotten and that your alliance has gotten from either the provincial government or from the proponents or both? Basically, do you feel that you're getting adequate consultation about all this?
It all comes back to what your definition of consultation is, right? Really, I'll be honest, the province has been remarkably responsive. I mean, you saw the decision that was made regarding Chedabucto and Georges Bay, basically saying, oh, we're going to wait until we have this federal process done. That's going to put the lines on the highway so we know what we're trying to do and where we're trying to do it and the rules that we're going to apply. That is a really refreshing perspective on the part of the province. Really, they listen to the concerns, they listen to the folks that are actually in the communities, and that was a fantastic decision that was made. It was very sensible. Now, the problem is when we're dealing with the proponent is basically ahead of the regulatory process. And so you have to ask yourself, who am I supposed to be talking to? And is it supposed to be talking to the regulator who's going to provide the best approach for protecting the environment, for making sure these are deployed in a sensible fashion and tied to a grid in a sensible fashion? Or should we rely instead on a proponent who is telling us these things that might be changing on an ongoing basis, and which, given the technology that's still in a stage of development, might be a completely different deployment as it happens on the landscape? I have had discussions with proponents. I often come away with from those discussions almost more confused than when I began them, simply because of some of these inconsistencies that we're talking about. So as it comes to consultation, the Regional Assessment Committee has been absolutely excellent. They've welcomed the engagement of the fishing industry to help inform their discussions and their deliberations. I mean, these are very, very difficult discussions when you're asking the fishing industry to say, can you identify any places which would be a good spot to put wind energy? Well, no, it's very difficult to do that because the ocean is a very, very busy place. But they've been receptive, they've been respectful. I almost, when I look at this, say that when I look at our engagement on a consultative level, we should be trying to provide information to the regulator to make the good decision. And then the proponent comes later, because the proponent is supposed to be following the regulator's recommendations and decisions as the rules of the road. So I'm somewhat more skeptical when it comes to engaging proponents at this stage. Really, the effectiveness of the consultation becomes quite questionable because nobody really knows what we're talking about.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I want to ask you as well, Chris, on that. We've talked a little bit about the international presence of wind energy development. And as the three of us mentioned here, it's still a fairly new technology for Canada. One of the things that we've been hearing over the past year from local representatives is that this is a technology that's been in use for years, actually decades, in places like Denmark and places like Scotland, England. So I just wonder, Chris, can you give me your viewpoint on whether you feel we're hearing the whole story in terms of the successes happening in Europe? But by the same token, you mentioned some areas where there have been troubles in different parts of the world in terms of wind energy. Can you expand a little on that for us?
Well, it depends on what your definition of a successful industry is, right? If you look at some of the North Sea developments, what you see is, okay, generally these are largely exclusionary zones when it comes to on the part of the commercial fishing industry. And really, this relates to the fact that you have infrastructure out there, a gathering infrastructure of high voltage. You cannot have that interacting with many types of fishing gear because it causes a liability problem. So therefore, you enter a situation where a fishery can no longer access an area. In some areas, you have actually had a regulator say, yes, we will provide you access to it for the fishing industry. And yet the insurance industry then steps up and says, no, we cannot provide liability coverage while you're fishing in there, simply because we can't get you by search and rescue because of radar concerns of wind turbines and access concerns. And if you happen to cause damage to that very, very expensive infrastructure, we don't have the backing to be able to cover it. So you have a lot of different mechanisms that prevent fishing operations from actually being able to operate within these areas. On the other side of this, you also have that fundamental change in the ecosystem itself. As you pointed out, many of these developments are somewhat new. In a lot of cases, they were put out there before we collected appropriate baseline information to see what the ocean was like before we put them out there. A great example is, they're starting to realize in some of those large Dogger Bank developments in the North Sea that you're actually seeing the thermal stratification begin to develop in these areas because all of that energy of the wind is being harnessed before it allows the water to turn over. The same thing is happening with nutrient profiles, that because that turnover caused by the wind, we're just not able to see that productivity happen. As it relates to, in the US, they're looking at what is going to be the impact on something like scallop spat distribution. Because scallops sit on the bottom of these banks and they release themselves up there. They got this little abyssal thread and they catch the wind-driven water and they distribute far afield. Well, when you remove the ability of the energy to actually do that, what's going to happen further afield? So with a local development, you can have a very, very, very far field impact. And so it's this combination of what I call those direct impacts, which might be related to exclusion and loss of access, and those indirect impacts, which might be related to the fact that you've altered the ecosystem. In many cases, even many of these structures act as fish aggregating devices. So if we look at something like large pelagics, like a rod and reel tuna fleet that operates quite extensively up in your area, what happens if all those pelagics move into, because there's lots of bait fish around, all of these little pilings that are sticking up in the water, and they can't access them anymore from their traditional grounds. So there's a lot of complexity to this piece that we're not quite there in understanding. And these other jurisdictions are beginning to bring these to light and say, okay, I think that it was put very well in a recent media article up in Guysborough, which said, make sure you ask the questions beforehand, because that's the only way that you're going to find an answer that actually makes sense at the back end.
Christine Babin, you're hearing all this, and your members have heard these types of things as well. What are they saying to you, and what's the feeling right now in terms of how quickly wind energy development is moving along, and knowing that some of the things that Chris are saying right now that have happened around the world could actually be happening locally?
Well, as I said at the beginning, it is a concern. You know, a lot of some of the proponents that I have met with, you know, they don't realize that we fish further, you know, offshore, not offshore, but we're not near shore like some people think we fish. You know, it's not like it was 30 or 40 years ago when we had small vessels, and the lobster industry in particular was fished, you know, mostly near shore. We've got a lobster fishery that goes, you know, as far as the boundary lines, the shipping lanes here, in particular in Chisholm-Beaton Bay. We have a fairly large snow crab fishery. Some of our members are tuna fishers, shrimp trap fishers, scallop fishers. So, you know, as Chris mentioned, there's just too much unknown as to the effects on these fish species. So when you're talking about someone's livelihood, that you know, that's their livelihood, that's what their business, that's how they pay their employees. It's a big economic value to our local community. So it is a concern, and we just want to make sure that it's done in a responsible manner, and you know, just not rushed, I guess. So there's a lot to be done before anything even goes in the water. So there's a lot of discussion left to be had still.
So, with that in mind, as we're winding down our conversation, where do we go from here? And I'd like to start with you, Christine Babin. What are you planning to do as an Inshore Fisheries Association and a member of this alliance? But also, what are you hoping to see happen in terms of the development of these wind energy setups, but also the local fisheries role in this development? Basically, what are you hoping for in the days and weeks to come?
Well, we are involved, the Alliance itself, we're involved in Arichat and some of the other government agencies. So we're trying to work together to find solutions, to find potential places where these, you know, developments could happen that would be less impactful on the fishing industry. So we hope to continue those discussions, and I'm very happy that the province decided to kind of hold back on the inshore and near shore, especially in Chisholm-Beaton Bay. There is a lot of talk with some developments moving forward with the Strait of Canso, but you know, that's many years in the making. So we're just hoping to continue these discussions with the government and the proponents. So just to kind of, you know, it's more than weeks. This is months and years of discussion still left to be had.
Last word on this goes to you, Chris Viscato, from the perspective of the Nova Scotia Fisheries Alliance. What are you hoping to see as the days, weeks, and months unfold on this particular discussion?
To be honest, I mean, Christine put it very well, and I would just expand it to say, you know, we're in the process of trying to develop legislation to understand how simple things like seabed tenure will be delivered out in Nova Scotian waters and how royalties would be collected. I mean, that gives us a fantastic opportunity to identify some lessons learned from the oil and gas process. For example, you know, would it not make sense to develop a fund based on royalties that would sit there in case we do find that there is an impact 15 or 20 years from now that impacts the livelihoods of families and communities? We have the opportunity to put this through the legislative framework of C49 right now. We appeared at the legislative committee as to try and shape this to help build it. We'll see what happens now. And so really, we're still trying to build the basic building blocks of which this whole industry is going to be regulated on. And we're still going to have to engage in that. On the other side, we know that the Regional Assessment Committee will be releasing kind of spatial blocks, potential future development areas in March. We intend to help them shape those and to identify activities that might be happening in these blocks such that as Christine said, if there's a rod and reel tuna fleet that funds an area very important, the proponents that might work in there need to know that so they know who to talk to when it comes to mitigation at the back end. So it comes down to making sure that the rules that govern the regulations of the development are in very, very good standing, and they're basically well thought out and look after most of the things that you don't really expect to see. And at the same time, to make sure that as these areas are identified and proponents come forward, they're educated on the existing activities, the future activities in light of climate change, and really have those lines of communication open. So at the end of the day, as the warden said, yes, you can coexist on the water. And the fact is, at this point, the conversations are still quite broad, far away, and we still seem to be driven somewhat by a rushed legislative process as opposed to one that's kind of patient, well thought out, and achieves the answers.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, so I thought we might. Do either of you have anything else you'd like to add to the conversation before we wrap things up here?
Thank you for the opportunity to have the fishing industry's side of things heard, and just to, for the viewers and our community to know that we are, not against offshore wind. We just want to make sure that it's done in a responsible manner.
Chris?
I would add to that, the most important thing that I would encourage your viewers to do is to engage, do the research, do a little bit of reading on the offshore wind industry, do a little bit of reading to understand what's happened in other areas of the world. You can learn from the shortcomings, you can learn where they did really strongly, and you can help generate a regulatory structure and a project structure that actually means that communities and people and families can still survive and use the coast. I mean, we have a fantastic resource when it comes to wild fish and seafood, and it would be a tragedy to lose it in face of another industry that's just fledgling now.
Well, we've appreciated getting both of your thoughts on this and adding to this sprawling conversation, certainly one that will be continuing as the weeks and months go by. But in the meantime, Christine Babin and Chris Fiscato, thank you both for joining me here on Telile's Roundtable today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Christine Babin is the Executive Director of the Richmond County Inshore Fishermen's Association. We've reached her at her home in West Arichat. And Chris Fiscato is the Manager for Energy Engagement for the Nova Scotia Fisheries Alliance. We've contacted him at his home office in Clementsville, Annapolis County. Stay tuned for more of Roundtable here on Telile Community Television in just a moment.
Here on Telile Community Television, we've been telling you about a planned joint council meeting that will take shape soon involving Richmond County and the town of Port Hawkesbury. Various members of the two municipalities have been meeting over the past couple of months to try to hammer out an agenda for this joint meeting. One member of Port Hawkesbury Town Council, Jason Aucoin, has been asking that funding for the Strait Area Pool at the Sarek High School site go on the agenda as part of a greater discussion about shared services and as part of an encouragement to both Richmond and Inverness counties to consider revising the funding formula for the pool. How do the Mayor of Port Hawkesbury and the Warden of Richmond County feel about these developments? Well, let's get some updates on the joint council meeting planning from Port Hawkesbury Mayor Brenda Chisholm-Beaton and the Warden of Richmond County, Amanda Mumbercat.
There have been several sort of preparatory discussions, recent meeting. Our council had agreed that to proceed in that direction, we would work on developing an agenda that had mutually agreed upon items on it, and I think that's where it sits right now. So we'll see what those agenda items shape up to be, and hopefully we can come up with a mutually agreed upon list. I can't imagine that would be difficult. We have so many great projects that we work on together. Everything from Cape Breton South Recruiting for Health to Eastern District Planning Commission to the Landry Lake Water Utility. These are services that make a difference in people's lives every day. So we need to make sure that we continue to collaborate in that way. So stay tuned.
It will be the first time that the town of Port Hawkesbury has met with the municipality of the county of Richmond. We want to make sure that we get off on the right foot. We want to make sure also that we reach some consensus with some of the potential topics that we could add to our very first meeting. If we did want to add absolutely everything, and I feel like over the past, I want to say 4 years, but really in essence, it's really been the past two terms, our relationship of collaboration has really grown. And today, particularly in this term, we have so many files that we share together. We have a lot to be proud about in terms of municipal collaboration. And really, I hope, and really the spirit of the conversation that happened is, how do we, first and foremost, celebrate that? And we want to definitely make sure we have room to talk about what does that future look like? What are some future projects we could be working on together, for the benefit of all of the people we represent in both of our municipalities. So definitely looking forward to having that first meeting between both councils. And it was a very exciting meeting. We're looking forward to continuing the process. And once we reach consensus on an agenda, then we will take the next step, which is to meet together.
Will that joint meeting include discussion on funding for the Strait Area Pool as requested by Councillor Jason Aucoin? If Warden Mumberket's comments following the latest regular meeting of Richmond Municipal Council are any indication, that may wind up being a separate conversation and not land on the joint meeting agenda.
The pool is not a joint project or a joint asset. So if we're talking about joint assets, then I think that's, we need to start somewhere, right? And maybe the intent is to eventually try to make it that, but honestly, at this point, it's owned by the town, and certainly open to having a conversation about it. But it's not quite the same as kind of these other projects that we have, where we have joint management and joint, interests, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think it's definitely important, an asset in our region, but doesn't quite fit the mold of all these other pieces. And we have so much in common and so much to talk about. It very well may need a separate conversation, and certainly the town has provided us with some excellent data in the past on, on the pool and the usage by Richmond County residents. We know it's an important asset, but right now it's not. For instance, like the airport, where it is jointly managed, it doesn't fall into that kind of category.
Whether or not the Strait Area Pool surfaces as a topic of conversation for the joint council meeting between Port Hawkesbury and Richmond County, Port Hawkesbury's mayor is still looking forward to taking a deep dive with her Richmond colleagues on topics that are of importance to both areas.
Whether or not we have that conversation at those meetings, that doesn't forego the fact that we will get all the information that we need both councils to have to them in some manner. If it's covered off in that joint meeting, great. And if we decide that that's not the correct forum to do that, then maybe it's a presentation to each of their councils. Maybe it's a staff report that goes from staff to staff, but I'm confident that we'll be able to get them the appropriate information on time for their budget deliberations. There's a ton of topics we could add to an agenda. Ideally, we can't meet for 2 solid days, so we'll have to prioritize a few items of mutually agreed upon agenda material, and it doesn't mean that we can't kind of check all those topics off the list of all the topics that are contributed from both of our councils. It's just going to take some time. So, you got to start somewhere. So we want to prioritize a few topics, make sure we leave a little room to talk about the future as well, maybe things we haven't thought about in terms of collaboration. And just have that as a starting point. And just kind of keep an eye on all of the topics that have been contributed by both of our councils, and just figure out eventually, hopefully we'll be able to discuss all of those topics that councils wish to discuss.
We are coming up to the 10-year anniversary of the closure of the former West Richmond Education Centre in Evanston, also known as the Walter Foucher School. For the past few years, Richmond municipal councillors and other local stakeholders have been trying to see if that former school building could be turned into affordable housing, especially in terms of attracting medical professionals to the area. Well, it looks like Richmond Municipal Council is going to see if it can find a buyer for the property as a result of decisions made at the latest regular meeting of Richmond Council. You're going to hear some highlights from that council meeting and commentary from the Warden of Richmond County, Amanda Mumberket, in just a moment. But first, here's a little background.
Richmond Council has officially issued a request for proposals for purchase and use of the former West Richmond Education Centre also known for many years as the Walter Fougere School. The Strait Regional School Board, now the Strait Regional Centre for Education, stopped holding classes in the Evanston building in 2014. The facility came under the municipality's control at the same time. Over the past 3 years, council and municipal staff have hoped to see the former school becoming part of healthcare professional recruitment strategies in the Strait area. Both the county and the Cape Breton South Recruiting for Health Committee felt the facility's closeness to the Strait Richmond Hospital would make it an ideal location to house doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals. But then the cost of refurbishing the building became an issue. An independent building assessment carried out for the county in 2021 described the former West Richmond Education Centre as being in fair to poor condition. The same building assessment put the price tag for 1 year's worth of necessary repairs at $1.6 million. So, council is looking to see what other individuals and organizations have in mind for the building, but they're trying to stick to their original plan of housing, whether or not that winds up being for medical professionals.
The committee discussed the request for proposals for the purchase and use of 19 School Road, Evanston, Nova Scotia, PID number 752-21366 and 7503-5865. I move that council accept the recommendation from the Committee of the Whole to proceed, as discussed in camera, with the request for proposals for the purchase and use of 19 School Road, Evanston, Nova Scotia, PID number 752-21366 and 750-35865.
The housing crisis has a home right here in Richmond County, and we are hearing from residents all the time that there are not enough places to live, and certainly not enough affordable places to live. So certainly with this RFP, we will be definitely looking for some folks to respond to include either full residential opportunities there or at least partial, because this is a priority for our council and it's a priority for our community based on what we're hearing. It's also a serviced area, so that's a big difference as well. But we feel that it's time for us to make a move on it. It took some time, the first couple of years of our term, to even get clear title to the building. Once that happened, we began to look at all kinds of different options around inclusionary zoning. At the end of the day, we've decided to issue the RFP and encourage that use for housing. It is close to the hospital. We know that there's not necessarily a commercial area there, but there's a lot of areas of Richmond County that don't have commercial centers, so we're very hopeful that there'll be a developer out there who sees an opportunity. With this evening's motion, you'll see the RFP come out in the coming days. In terms of the closing, it will depend on a little bit of when it actually gets out there and gets published. So, but all that information will be contained in the RFP.
The request for proposals for the former Evanston School building wasn't the only action taken by councillors at this regular meeting that could impact the development of the former West Richmond Education Centre. The February 25th regular council meeting in Arichat saw second reading approval given to amendments to the land use bylaw for central Richmond County. These amendments direct institutional buildings in this part of the county to be repurposed as dwellings. According to Warden Amanda Mumbercat, the initial use of the phrase institutional buildings is directed towards former schools, but it could be opened up to such facilities as churches and medical facilities that are also no longer in use.
So in that particular area would be the school, it would be the Strait Richmond Hospital, it would be St. Francis de Sales, maybe the community center. I'd have to double check on that, but there's a few considered institutional. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we're trying to do is remove any barriers that we can for developers. It's not always easy for us because we are a municipality that's not completely serviced with water and sewer infrastructure. What we do have for that type of infrastructure in many areas, it's aging, but we are in a good position with the Evanston system, and we think, like I said, there's a real opportunity there, and hopefully there'll be a developer out there who can really see a vision for that particular property, but also hopefully other areas as well. So.
And there you have it. That wraps up this week's edition of Roundtable here on Telile Community Television. Thank you for tuning in, and a special thank you to my interview guests this week, Christine Babin, Chris Viscato, Chris Deliberatore, and Amanda Mubberket. If you have any thoughts about what you've seen on Telile Community Television's Roundtable over the past hour, or you'd simply like to make suggestions for a future edition of the show, feel free to contact me directly, or you can contact Telile Community Television at our studios here in Arichat. And be sure to follow Telile on social media. For now, I'm Adam Cook. Thank you once again for joining me for this week's edition of Roundtable. I look forward to seeing you again next week with a brand new show. Bye for now.